Hello, Malcolm here, and welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips, episode 313. We're continuing our series called the Beatitudes and Effective Communication, and today we're looking at the last of the Beatitudes. You see, what would it be like if we could preach and teach through the lens of the Beatitudes? What might the impact be on you and I as speakers and on our congregations in listening if we could live and inhabit and teach through these Beatitudes? I wonder what that impact would be. Now today, we're on to the final Beatitude in verse 10 of chapter 5 of Matthew, and it reads, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." It's rather interesting that the warning here about, or perhaps the promise of persecution, follows the Beatitude about peacemaking in the previous verse. And perhaps that's to remind us that our efforts at being a peacemaker may not always be appreciated. The issue is so important to Jesus that he does what he does. He does what he didn't do for any of the other previous Beatitudes, which is that he expands on it in verses 11 and 12 here, where he says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Let's talk about the meaning of this Beatitude in the context of the gospel as a whole. And the first thing to note is that it's all about the kingdom. We see that the reward is the kingdom of heaven. And we find here an inclusio. An inclusio is a technical thing which refers to the fact that there's something that's bracketing a whole body of teaching. And we see this here with the Beatitudes, because the first Beatitude in chapter 3, in verse 3, says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So the kingdom of heaven is there at the beginning as a promise, and the kingdom of there is there at the end of the Beatitudes as a reinforced promise. And so it tells us something about what it means to be a kingdom citizen, which is that, well, we are marked by persecution. It's part of the package. We receive the kingdom, and part of that is to do with being persecuted. Now, being righteous is not the same as being good or noble. The world doesn't persecute the good and the noble because they would like to be like them, or perhaps they feel they could be like them. The world persecutes the righteous person because they do not want to be like them, or they sense they cannot be like them. The righteous are different because they are different. In a sense, they're not trying to be different, they just are different, and the world doesn't like it. They're different by nature, not just by speech or actions. It's something that's changed inside us. You see, these Beatitudes are about an inner change that produces, obviously, a different lifestyle, but it's something internal. As it says in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 13 and 14, "Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened." Of course, Jesus anticipated persecution for his followers, and he experienced it himself. He says in John chapter 15, verses 18 to 20, I'll just quote you this smaller section, "If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also." Did they persecute Jesus? I think they did. You're going to get the same thing. And persecution may not come from the world. It can also come from Christian-type people. Not only was Jesus persecuted by the religious leaders of his day, but Paul suffered from false brothers and perhaps also false sisters. In 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 26, he references the fact that he has been in danger from false believers. So why is this beatitude here in this list? It's because persecution is both inevitable and, you could even say, necessary. In the book Embracing Creation, John Mark Hicks, Bobby Valentine, and Mark Wilson, authors, say this: Yahweh scattered humanity at Babel, Israel through exile, and the church through persecution. Would the church have grown and spread if persecution had not happened? Maybe not. And there are some things that are circumstantial to the time of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 8 in particular, but perhaps there's something still there for you and me to understand, that at times persecution is necessary if the gospel is going to be spread. So that's the context of the gospel. What about the meaning of this for you and I as a preacher or a teacher? Well, I would say that a preacher or a teacher that's fully invested in this beatitude will not be afraid to live righteously, even if it brings them persecution, whether from inside or outside the church. So how do we prepare with these things in mind? Well, firstly, this beatitude reminds us to check our motives in what we are going to say, whether we're going to say words that are encouraging to the point of sentimentality, that's one danger, or we're going to say things that are designed to annoy. Why are we doing what we're doing? Because persecution here in this context is about persecution because of righteousness, not because of obnoxiousness. The cause of persecution in the gospel here Jesus is talking about is righteousness, persecution that comes to you or I because of our own folly, our lack of wisdom, our overzealous behavior. Our self-righteousness should not be justified by the use of this verse. If you get that persecution for those reasons, then that's your own problem. That's nothing to do with being godly. Secondly, regarding preparation, you and I need to prepare ourselves by praying to live righteously. Certainly not perfectly, that's not what we're talking about here, but to live righteously. It's the life as much as the teaching that should get a preacher or teacher persecuted. For example, Jesus eating with the so-called wrong people caused people to turn against him. That was what caused a lot of the persecution, not necessarily what he was actually saying. Now, how about in presentation? Well, I would say a couple of things. Firstly, when we teach our lessons, we serve our hearers best, not when we teach them how to avoid persecution, but how to see God in the persecution they receive. Pointing people to Jesus Christ himself. Hebrews 12 verse 3. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. When we are going through a period of persecution as a congregation, or people in our church are, point people to Christ, not how to get out from under the persecution. And teaching people to lean on God during times of opposition is so important. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 10. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, Paul says, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Referring back to the beginning of the book of 2 Corinthians, where Paul talks about the difficulty he was under that taught him to lean on God, to look for God, to seek for God, to depend on him. Let's teach our people, when they're persecuted, to lean on God for the strength they need. God will provide it. And let's also be sure to remind people of the rewards. The kingdom of heaven in this context, but also Jesus said in Mark chapter 10, verses 29 and 30, if they leave a home or brothers or sisters, whatever they leave behind, they'll receive 100 times as much, along with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. We will receive that reward. Reassure people the reward is coming. Reassure people that God's strength will be available, and reassure people that Christ is with them. He understands, and they are living into the life of Christ as they endure persecution. Persecution, of course, is somewhat relative. Sometimes what we consider to be persecution is nothing more than a bit of an annoyance, frankly. There are people in other parts of the world who are really enduring more what we might properly characterize as persecution compared to what we see in the New Testament. A couple of last things. Firstly, don't mistake feedback for persecution. Speaking makes you and I vulnerable, and sometimes even constructive feedback can feel like persecution. However, most of the time we get feedback from people on our speaking. It's simply that. It's just feedback and nothing more. Don't interpret all criticism as persecution. It's a temptation to do so, and sometimes it can be that, but it rarely is. Even the people that critique us in a critical, negative way are offering us something useful. Don't lose that nugget of gold when it's embedded in the mud and the mess of someone's attitude that isn't exactly Christ-like, but nonetheless there can be something useful there. I forget who said this. I made this note a while ago when I was doing some research on persecution. I hadn't referenced the source, but I'll just read you this quote that I noted down. It is moving and significant that the suffering church in lands where it is oppressed does not want to be like the church in the West. It looks for our prayers, not that it may have an easy time, but that it may be faithful unto death, and know the joy of utter faithfulness to Jesus. There is no joy like that. There's some truth in that, isn't there? Jesus didn't say because you're going to be persecuted, it's going to be miserable to be a Christian. There's something about living into the life of Christ, including his difficulties and persecutions, that gives us more of the joy of Christ. And that comes only if we have the peace of Christ that passes understanding. And that's what we must pass on to our congregations when they're going through a tough time. Show them the peace of Christ. Show them the love of Christ. Live it out yourself. And then if you or your congregation are persecuted because of righteousness, not only will you know you're a kingdom citizen, but you'll know the joy of the life of Christ. Well, next week we'll wrap up our series on the Beatitudes with an overview, but for today I'd like to know what you think about this one. How can we preach and teach in a way that is informed by this 8th Beatitude? What kinds of questions does this bring to your mind regarding preaching and teaching? Why not pray over the Beatitudes, asking God to reveal how they can flavor your speaking? If God reveals anything to you, please drop me a line. Please add your comments on this week's topic and leave them publicly so we can learn from each other, because we learn best when we're learning in community. If you've got any questions about the Bible, theologically, technically, practically, send me your questions. My email is malcolm@malcolmcox.org. And if you would like a copy of my free book on spiritual disciplines called How God Grows His People, sign up for my weekly newsletter at the website malcolmcox.org. Please pass the link on, subscribe, leave a review, and I pray that whether you experience persecution or not this next few days, that you'll be able to understand and remember you are a kingdom citizen. You're following Jesus Christ, and you can bring that joy and peace to the people you speak to next time. Till the next time, do remember to keep calm and carry on teaching. Take care, and God bless.